Going to Byron Bay. In the surf we watch the dolphins play, yeah. Going to Byron Bay. Even if it's just for one day, yeah.
The Palestinian people have been brutally oppressed. It's documented. There is no reason to remain ignorant of this fact. The BDS movement aims to address that fact, and we're here today to encourage a reasonable and cautious dialogue around the issue of Palestinian sovereignty. We're not here to attack Jewish character. We're not here for racism or bigotry. There's no room for that in this movement. I'd like to make that perfectly clear. Above and beyond that, the important part of this process is that we respect one another and we strip away the labels, ultimately, and consider our shared humanity. This is what it's about. It's not being about one thing or another. It's about sharing common human rights. And these are inalienable human rights that are enshrined in international law. Omar Barghouti telling you like it is. I'm going to introduce our next speaker. We're going to go through some guest speakers, ending with Jake Lynch. Gareth Smith is, as you might well know, a prolific letter writer and has been an activist on many issues, including the nuclear, East Timor, and now has dedicated his passions to Palestine. Please welcome Gareth Smith.
I've got so much to talk about, but so little time. People ask me, why are you getting involved in the Palestinian issue? Don't you consider there are evils being done in Central Africa or in Iraq or in North Korea? And so they give me a litany of other countries where bad things are happening. Very quickly, the touchstone for me is the fact that this country is in collusion with Israel, just as it was with Indonesia. Without going into any detail, a third of the population of East Timor was exterminated, and right now, some estimates put 700,000 West Papuans dead at the hands of Kopassa Special Forces, trained up the road at Canungra Military Base and in West Australia at the Pierce Air Force Base. This is the nature of Australia, both for the coalition and for the ALP governments. There's no real discrimination between them. By the way, is our federal MP Justine Elliott in the audience? Put your hand up, Justine. We issued an invite for her to come here tonight, and as I expected, she hasn't shown up. We did send a delegation from Byron Friends of Palestine to see her, and we got the usual flannel that it's not just Israel, you know, look at Hamas, look at the rockets they're sending across the border, and so on. The second thing I want to say is this. As far as Israel is concerned, we have Bill Shorten, the leader of the opposition, taking a trade delegation to Israel. And the next trade delegation to Israel will be led by the head of the CSIRO. Our politicians flock to Israel, lots of their expenses paid by Jewish interests, Zionist interests in Melbourne. No other country in the world merits this degree of attention from Australia. I just want to say that the essence of what we should be doing here in Byron Bay, with 1.5 million international visitors coming here, we have a unique role to play in influencing all these people that come to our shores. We must never, ever, ever normalize the abnormal. The Israeli society is a sick society. You can look at Haaretz and read the reports there, or the various other news media in Israel, and see what the economy is like. They even advertise on Haaretz for donations to help the poor in Israel. And yet we're talking about the 11th most powerful military on the planet. with $3 billion a year flowing into Israel from the United States. No strings attached. And that's apart from the flow of weapons. You may remember last year, the attack on Gaza, which killed over 2,000 people. When they ran out of ammunition in Israel, America very quickly flooded the place with extra rockets and extra bullets. No holds barred. How many of you have heard of the Arms Trade Treaty? Just put your hands up. Very few. And yet this was to be the hallmark of Australia's presidency of the Security Council. This was mainly Julie Bishop's pet project to stop the flow of weapons to regimes which violate human rights. I mean, is this going to have any effect on the flow of weapons to Israel? Do they need any more evidence about how dense inert metal explosive is used? Where the doctors at the Shifa hospital in Gaza report injuries never before seen to medical science. Limbs severed as if by some butcher's spinning blade. Or what about the use of rubber bullets? I urge you to look at Breaking the Silence. They published a book called Our Harsh Logic. These are Israeli military veterans who've actually found their consciences now that they're as old as I am and perhaps a little younger. They've suddenly become aware of the evils that they perpetrated. Read through what they confess to, like a Givati brigade general telling his troops, "I want bodies, bring me bodies." And by the way, it's the Givati brigade which gets goodies and chocolates and other comfort foods from the Strauss company, which is the ultimate owner of Max Brenner's chocolate shops, and there's one up the road in the Gold Coast at Southport. I'll be visiting them soon to read extracts from Our Harsh Logic. They can't accuse me of being anti-Semitic because I'm using the actual words of Israeli military veterans. They can speak for themselves. It's time for me to finish and let Rihab speak. But let me finish on this point, a story for you. There's a Bible story. Moses struck a rock and water gushed out. And Moses thought, well, this is swell. Here I am in the desert, fresh, clear water. So he stripped off and he jumped into the water and bathed. And when he got out of the water, his clothes had been pinched. An Israeli had stolen it. And when that story was told, an Israeli popped up and said, no, that couldn't have been us, we weren't there. Thank you, you've just proved my point.
Thank you, Gareth. Our next speaker is Rihab Charida of Palestinian origin, a journalist and filmmaker. I think it's very important that we hear the voices of those that Israel has dispossessed. So please welcome Rihab.
Thank you. I first wanted to pay my respects to the elders of the country that this gathering is taking place, the Bunjalung elders past and present, and to express my absolute solidarity with the first peoples of this continent and surrounds that experienced their own Nakba more than 200 years ago. I think that it's really important when we talk about the boycott movement in Palestine to recognise that, like all boycott movements in the past, it's the product of world powers and governments doing nothing, basically to stop Israeli impunity and to stop the level of Israeli criminality that has been unleashed, especially on the people in Gaza, but also on the people in the West Bank whose daily lives has just been completely destroyed. So every level of society, education, the economy, there's no semblance of a normal life that Palestinians under Israeli military occupation experience. So Israeli occupation has abnormalized life completely. But also, as Amar Barghouti points out, the majority of Palestinians actually live in exile. And so I don't want to speak too long, but I just want to make one point about the right of return, because the three demands of the boycott movement, basically, of the BDS movement, are that, and as soon as these demands are met, there's no need for the boycott movement. But basically the three demands are an end to the military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, equality for citizens that now live within the so-called State of Israel, who are of Palestinian origin, and for the right of return of Palestinian refugees. So Palestinian refugees, the refugee issue was created when Israel was established. Israel was created on top of, literally on top of, the destruction of over 400 Palestinian villages, which were completely razed, completely destroyed, in order for Israel to be created on what became 78% of historic Palestine. That is 70%, so the people of those villages were ethnically cleansed out of Palestine, or out of their towns and homes. Many of them went to the West Bank and Gaza. So the population of Gaza, for example, over 80% of that population are refugees from other parts of Palestine that were ethnically cleansed during the creation of Israel. So 70% of the entire population were forced out of their homes. Today that translates into 7 out of 10 Palestinians around the world aren't in Palestine and can't be, are not allowed to be in Palestine. So a Jewish citizen of Brooklyn can pull a credit card out of their wallet, book a ticket to Israel and get citizenship before leaving the airport because of their Jewish ancestry. But Palestinians who were born and raised in these villages, who've been there for generations, who've worked the land, who've lived on and with the land for generations, cannot be there. So the right of return is at the heart of the Palestinian struggle, and it's really, unless these demands are met, the boycott movement, will, basically continue. And it has gained a lot of strength over the years. Many more gains than the South African boycott achieved, for example, in the little time. And I think that's because of, there are so many governments that defy international law, but Israeli exceptionalism on an international scale is like no other. No other government gets away with the kinds of things that Israel has gotten away with. And so that's another reason for the BDS. And it is effectively a non-violent movement, but it's also the most effective way that people outside of Palestine can express their solidarity with Palestinians, because the call did come from Palestinians saying this is how we can, defeat Israeli colonial expansionism, which hasn't stopped. Israel continues to expand, continues to move Palestinians off their lands. The areas around Jerusalem now are being, ethnically cleansed as we speak. So Israeli expansionism hasn't stopped. It's not as though the colonization happened in 1948 and that was it. It continues all the time. And Israel has never defined its own borders. They ask us, do you believe in Israel's right to exist? Where? Show me the borders of where it's meant to exist. Even Israel won't define its own borders. I wish it would define its own borders. I just want to end with a statement. A really quick statement that was written in August last year in the New York Times. It was a letter that was written by 47 Holocaust survivors and 287 descendants of Holocaust victims. As Jewish survivors and descendants of survivors and victims of the Nazi genocide, we unequivocally condemn the massacre of Palestinians in Gaza. Obviously they're referring to the last attack on Gaza last July. And the ongoing occupation and colonization of historic Palestine. We call for the full economic, cultural and academic boycott of Israel. Never again must mean never again for anyone. This is just one example of many that are joining the boycott movement, and that will continue to grow. But we're all here to hear Jake Lynch speak, so maybe in discussion time we can talk a bit more.
As some of you will be aware, Jake Lynch was the subject of a legal case that was launched by the Shurat Haddin Legal Centre in Sydney. The claim that Jake's function as the director of the Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies, embracing the boycott and divestments and sanctions campaign in the academic dimension by refusing a fellowship to an Israeli academic was perceived as a breach of the Racial Discrimination Act in Australia. I'm very happy to say that that case was defeated, and Jake is here to speak about his experiences and the motivation and the principles behind his decision. Please welcome Associate Professor Jake Lynch.
Well, thank you, Duncan, and good evening, everybody. I will indeed speak about my experiences and those of my centre in our support for the academic boycott of Israel. And I will make a few remarks about the kind of arguments that we tend to hear and the kind of issues that tend to crop up in discussions about that in the Australian context. But first of all, as you may have noticed, I brought along a prop, an orange. And it's to celebrate the fact that these days I can eat oranges with a clear conscience. See, that wasn't the case when I was a lad growing up in right-thinking North London in the 1970s. Back then, you could only get fascist oranges from Spain, racist oranges from South Africa, or Zionist oranges from Israel. 2 down, 1 to go. And indeed, the oppressive domination of the Palestinians by the State of Israel will eventually find its way into the dustbin of history for the same reason that fascism finally receded in Europe and apartheid finally came to an end in South Africa. Because it is a massive, programmatic denial of human potential. And that human potential is stronger, ultimately, than the attempt to deny it. So we here can be confident that we are on the right side of history. Now, I know it doesn't always feel that way. I too was an activist against apartheid in South Africa. In my student days, I had that poster on the wall of my room in my bedsit, Nelson Mandela, "The struggle is my life." Now, because I had difficulties in keeping a girlfriend for any more than a couple of days, my mates changed mine to read Jake Lynch, "My Life is a Struggle," but that's another story. Back then, one of my flatmates was an Israeli, just to prove I have no discriminatory motive here. So every time a letter came to the flat addressed to the occupier, I gave it to him. But that's to digress somewhat. The point is that we used to assemble outside branches of Tesco's in Cardiff, where I was a student, under the leadership of Hanif Bamji. And Hanif was a South African exile, a very kind of passionate, ferocious kind of speaker. And he used to give us a rousing speech as we gathered outside on a Saturday morning amid the rather puzzled and nonplussed shoppers around us going about their business. And he used to culminate this speech by saying, "We're going to hit it! We're going to hit it!" he would say. And what he meant by that was that he would go and have a cup of tea while we went and stuck stickers on tins of South African fruit. So we were considered slightly offbeat. We were considered a slightly fringe interest in those days. But ultimately, of course, things changed. People in the Federation of Conservative Students at the time, who would go around wearing badges saying "Hang Mandela," buried them somewhere at the bottom of their sock drawer. Everybody suddenly discovered that they had been against apartheid all along. But only now could they feel free to say it. And it reminds me of an observation attributed to the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, that every new idea goes through 3 phases of acceptance. First, ridicule, then violent opposition, and then everybody sees this idea as having been self-evident all along. Opposition to fascism, opposition to apartheid in South Africa, certainly conforms to that pattern. And I believe the rapid growth and spread of the movement for boycott, divestment and sanctions on Israel is describing exactly the same trajectory. I saw a very good movie recently, The Theory of Everything. It's a dramatized version of the life of the Cambridge physicist Stephen Hawking. Very eminent chap, probably one of the most famous academics in the world. Not many academics attain fame, let me tell you, outside a very small and select coterie of people of like interests, but Stephen Hawking was one of them. So when he joined the boycott, a couple of years ago. At the prompting of boycott activists in the UK, he refused to attend a conference organised in Israel at the behest of President Shimon Peres. He attributed that decision to his desire to render solidarity to Palestinian colleagues, for whom, of course, many of the freedoms we take for granted in academic life in the West are routinely denied. And so when Stephen Hawking joined the boycott, I knew we must be on the right track. And if there is, as the film's title suggests, a theory of everything, then that solidarity must surely have a place in it. But of course, I don't want to minimise the opposition we face here in Australia. We can definitely count on being received with scorn and ridicule by various figures from the serried ranks of politics and media, ministers, members of parliament, columnists, all the same people, in fact, who have spent much of the last 15 years maintaining that David Hicks must be guilty of something because the Americans say he is. Now, just on this very day, David Hicks stands fully vindicated. What does that tell you about the conventional wisdom of Australian politics and media, I wonder? Now, one of the objections we commonly meet when I advocate for a boycott of Israel is why Israel should be singled out for boycott. Don't other governments of other countries behave with an equally unpleasant manner towards their citizens or towards the people of other countries, I am often asked. Well, yes, they do. There are other countries, for example, which are in military occupation of territory which is recognised as belonging to someone else. Armenia in Nagorno-Karabakh, Morocco in Western Sahara, to take two examples. There are other countries which systematically discriminate on the basis of religion. It's quite possible that it will eventually turn out that the Rohingya Muslims of Rakhine State in Burma, or as we call it these days, Myanmar, have suffered exactly that kind of discrimination with at least the connivance of the authorities there, if not the active participation. There are, unfortunately, many other countries which abuse human rights in various forms. There are even one or two other countries which stockpile nuclear weapons illegally outside the Non-Proliferation Treaty, India and Pakistan, for instance. But as I go through the list, I'm sure the point is emerging in your mind that there is only one country which does all of these things. You can see it as a Venn diagram, and as I add more and more circles to this Venn diagram, the overlap in the middle shrinks further and further until there is only one occupant left, namely Israel. Israel has an unparalleled record of militarism and lawlessness, and that is why Israel is singled out for boycott. Now, of course, one of the chief aspects of Israeli lawlessness, if not the most important one, has been its shift of population into the territory it occupies, which is a straightforward contravention of the Fourth Geneva Convention. Now, this would come perhaps as slightly puzzling news to the person in charge of Australia's relations with the rest of the world, namely Julie Bishop. When Julie Bishop, as Foreign Minister, visited Israel to attend the funeral of Ariel Sharon, she took trouble to be photographed along with her Israeli counterpart, Avigdor Lieberman, an outspoken advocate of ethnic cleansing. She was interviewed by a journalist from an online newspaper, The Times of Israel. And she demanded of this journalist, which bit of international law is it anyway that makes these settlements illegal? She said impatiently. Well, only the best known bit, Julie, Gen Con 4, as we call it, which makes the issue abundantly clear. So there's a problem. There's a problem there because the wording of the convention could not be more categorical. It is a military occupation. It is illegal to move or transfer any portion of population by the occupying power into the territory it occupies. So what's the solution? Well, the solution from Attorney General George Brandis was simple. Why not simply declare that henceforth Australia no longer regards East Jerusalem as occupied territory? Problem solved. Problem solved. So really, the centre of gravity of official political opinion here in Australia on these issues reminds me quite often of the positioning of influential sections of the coalition political parties, the Murdoch press, with regard to the separate issue of human-induced climate change. There, the overwhelming majority of qualified opinion around the world is of one mind, but that doesn't matter, because the homespun wisdom of the young liberals can tell us different. So just because the vast majority of climate scientists believe that human-induced climate change is underway and a threat to various aspects of our well-being, that doesn't matter. Australia can still dig up all that coal to be sold and burned with impunity, according to these people. People, remember, who were very adamant that David Hicks was guilty of something. So, similarly, the vast majority of qualified legal opinion around the world is perfectly clear on this subject, that it's an illegal military occupation and Israel must absolutely not move any portion of its population into the territory it occupies. So next time you hear that issue being equivocated, either in print or in politics or in some ministerial pronouncement, just remember we have to keep hold of our right to these facts. In my former profession of journalism, of course, is very preoccupied, as it should be, with distinguishing facts from claims. Facts from claims. And there have been difficulties in the past, which I'm sure we all remember, when claims were repeated so often as to attain the misleading impression of being facts. Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction, for example. But there are problems of at least equal magnitude and seriousness when things we should regard as facts are instead misleadingly presented as claims. Only one side of the story, to which there is an equal and opposite other side which demands to be taken equally seriously. I'm afraid we should have as a starting point the fact that human-induced climate change is underway. We should take as a starting point the illegality and unacceptability of Israel's military occupation of Palestinian territory and its illegal settlements on Palestinian land. And they should be a starting point for our debate rather than something to be debated. So that's the first issue. Why is Israel singled out? The answer is its unparalleled record of militarism and lawlessness. The second issue that people raise with me is, why bring universities into this? Universities, after all, should be seen as oases, as a privileged enclave of academic inquiry. Nothing to do with politics, nothing to do with military occupations or anything like that. Well, my answer to people who say that is they often say to me, I don't want to get involved, Jay. You know, why should you involve us? Don't get me involved in this. You do it, okay? My answer is, well, I'm afraid we are all already involved. We're already involved. You know, there was a sad development this week when it's concerning the international solidarity activist Rachel Corrie, the American activist Rachel Corrie, who was killed by an Israeli bulldozer which ran over her back in 2003, nearly 12 years ago. And ever since then, her family have been trying to get some form of justice for her through the Israeli courts. But the very clear issues they started with were buried and obfuscated under so many layers of legal process and contrivance that this week the last flickering hope that they might eventually get that justice through the Israeli legal system was decisively snuffed out. And the family's statement points out that what they have come to realize through all these years is that every institution in Israeli society is deeply complicit in the occupation of Palestinian territory and the abuses and cruelties that entails. There is no portion of Israeli society that is exempt from that. So this is where the issue starts to come home to us in universities, such as my own at the University of Sydney. Because you see, like many universities, ours is deeply enmeshed in the dense weave of connections and complicity which links Australian higher education with its Israeli counterpart. We run fellowship schemes in partnership with the Technion University and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Now, these are slightly strange because, as academics in the audience will know, the stated aim of fellowship schemes is usually to promote academic excellence, to promote excellence in research. And they're typically offered by governments or foundations or embassies, people like this. And generally speaking, the field of potential applicants is thrown open as far as possible, as would make sense. You want the maximum number of people to apply to maximize your chances of getting the best candidates with the best projects. So that's in keeping with the stated aim of academic excellence. There's something extremely fishy, therefore, about these fellowship schemes that link Sydney University with these two Israeli universities, because the Technion Fellowship Scheme is open only to academic staff from that university. And the Sir Zalman Cowen Fellowship Scheme is open only to academic staff at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Why artificially limit the potential field of applicants if your aim is indeed to promote excellence in research? Well, it rather gives the game away, because the aim is not to promote excellence in research. The aim is to exploit the reputation of academic research to sanitize Israel's image and to normalize relations with what we should regard as an abnormal and unacceptable society and its behavior. How do I know that, I hear you cry? Well, of course, in the process of researching these links between my university and these Israeli universities, we did quite a bit of research into the specific ways in which they play a complicit role in the military occupation of Palestinian territory. So, for example, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem accredits military training courses. If you want to get a certificate or a diploma from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, you can do it in the normal way by studying the works of Plato or looking into the treasures of ancient Greece or perhaps finding out how to make interesting smells in the chemistry lab, just like any other student anywhere. But you can also get that certificate or that diploma through your prowess in using the latest high-tech weaponry to target the Palestinians. So in other words, military qualifications are given the imprimatur of a proper university by the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Could it be coincidence, I ask myself, that its board of governors is chaired by one Michael Federman, the same Michael Federman who also chairs Elbit Systems, one of Israel's biggest defense manufacturers. So there are myriad examples, and they're just two, of how the Hebrew University of Jerusalem is directly complicit in the occupation. What about the Technion University? Well, the laboratories of the Technion University in Haifa attained notoriety because academics there collaborated with military hardware companies, arms dealers, to develop the DB9, which is a remote-controlled armored bulldozer which is used to demolish Palestinian homes. So that's a very obvious, very overt, very objectionable form of collaboration between academics and the military. But of course there are more subtle and more insidious forms of cooperation, including by academics close to my own field, social scientists, experts in communication, because the Technion University houses the Samuel Nieman Institute. The Samuel Nieman Institute. And a few years ago, it was commissioned to produce the Nieman Report on public diplomacy. The client was the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And this report on public diplomacy is a research report testing out various ideas on strategically sampled segments of populations of countries around the world in terms of the associations they make at the mention of the name Israel. And it's about how to effectively change the subject in the international community. So it's really saying, well, you know, Israel can't afford to have this kind of word association uppermost in people's minds, that when people in the Belgiums, the Indias, the Australias, all the countries around the world, when they hear the name Israel, they think, ah yes, occupation of Palestinian territory. No, you have to change the subject. Make them think instead, ah, Israel, ah yes, innovative techniques for hydroponic agriculture, or Israel. Ah, yes, what an interesting young film industry the country has. So it's trying to think how to reposition Israel, to rebrand Israel in the eyes of the international community, with the avowed aim of lessening the pressure for a change in its oppressive policies towards the Palestinians. And the Neiman report was compiled by a long list of academics from the Technion and other universities who are exponents of subjects such as communication and social science. So that's a direct form or an indirect form, I should say, of complicity with Israel's programmatic oppression of the Palestinians being carried out through the Technion University in Haifa. So in these ways, for the University of Sydney to lend its name to institutional links with these universities is to confer on them a wholly undeserved aura of legitimacy within the international academic system. These universities should be seen as wholly aberrant and abhorrent by other academics because they are complicit in a system of relations which denies basic freedoms to Palestinians, including Palestinian academics in Palestinian universities. But instead, we are all immersed willy-nilly, whether we like it or not, in conferring this ersatz approval on them. So unless we stand out against that, unless we make our own stand and take our own perspective on it, then we are ourselves unwittingly complicit in the sustaining of that occupation. So we have to jump off that train. We have to accept ourselves. We have to say, no, we're not going to cooperate with this. And of course, that's what lay behind the specific policy adopted by myself and my centre at the University of Sydney a few years ago to declare that we should boycott these particular fellowship schemes and to call on the university's Vice-Chancellor, Dr. Michael Spence, to rescind them forthwith. Now, of course, Dr. Spence wrote back saying, thank you very much for your letter, Associate Professor Lynch, but I have no intention of doing any such thing. And he even referred the matter to Australian diplomacy and said it would be inappropriate to boycott links with the universities of any country with whom or with which Australia has diplomatic connections. So he is referencing the university's behaviour onto political opinion in Australia. But he risks the university, therefore, falling into disrepute, because on this issue there is a large and divergent chasm between political opinion on the one hand and public opinion on the other hand. You know, there's a very famous piece of research on the news about Israel and the Palestinians, which was carried out in the UK, now the field work now about 12 or 13 years ago. And it takes the form of showing people various excerpts from television news and getting their responses. But as a preamble to that phase of the research, the two academics who carried it out, Greg Farlow and Mike Berry, asked Britons who were going to take part in this research what it was they thought they knew about the conflict. And at one stage, more of them believed it was the Palestinians who were occupying the occupied territories than realised it was the Israelis. They had heard the words occupied and occupation in passing, but nobody ever explained what they meant. Now, Greg Farlow and Mike Berry were two people who gave evidence a couple of years later to an independent review of the BBC's coverage of the issue, commissioned by the corporation's then Board of Governors. And one of its main findings was that the BBC was, as it put it, constrained by a straitjacket of balance. And constrained, therefore, from conveying the reality of the situation, which is the profound imbalance between an occupying power in control of events and an occupied people whose lives are controlled. Now, a few modest reforms eventually flowed from that report. One of them is that you will still hear BBC correspondents now and again explaining that the settlements are seen as illegal under international law, though Israel disputes this, which is quite a good formula, really. because it's factual. They are seen as illegal. And the fact that Israel disputes it should be reported. But it also, as if inadvertently, makes the point that everyone else believes they are illegal. Only Israel maintains this fiction. So that was quite useful. At the time, I ventured into the public print to greet the governor's report as vindication for arguments I've been making for many years. I was at that time an on-air presenter for BBC World Television News, but that arrangement came to a swift end when, when my boss informed me that it would be very odd for a presenter to be seen to be siding with the report. Excuse me. So my bosses in BBC News saw this report as an attack on them, and they were determined to have me on their side or not at all. Wiser counsels prevailed, but I think they saw it eventually as an opportunity to reform their coverage and make it more informative to audiences. Now, a couple of years ago, a wide-ranging opinion survey was commissioned by the Middle East Monitor, conducted by a polling company, ICM, in the UK and several other European countries, and it found that by then, publics could indeed successfully identify Israel as the occupier of someone else's territory, and therefore that was likely to feed through into political process. And when some of the votes have come up at the United Nations General Assembly in recent years for Palestine to have the status of an observer member, for example, there's been some surprise, I think, that some of the usual suspects, countries which generally vote with the United States, nailed on NATO allies such as Belgium, Italy and so forth, have voted in favour of those motions. As we know, one of them, that particular one to recognise Palestine, was opposed by the Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, at the time. And she wanted Australia to vote against it. Only by the last-minute intervention and ministrations of Australia's Foreign Minister, Bob Carr, was that embarrassment averted, and Australia ended up abstaining instead. I noted with particular satisfaction, by the way, that Bob Carr, as a founder member a generation ago of Australian Friends of Israel, has become the founder member more recently of Australian Friends of Palestine, an indication of how the issue has switched. So that's where we were. We were at the point, therefore, where we were determined to boycott these fellowship schemes within the university. And one fine day, as if out of a clear blue sky, I received an email from a professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, one Dan Avnon, informing me that he was just about to put in his application for a Sir Zelman Cowen Fellowship to come to Sydney, and would I be one of his endorsers? To which I wrote back saying, well, Professor, I have nothing against you personally, but the answer is no, because of my and CPAC's boycott policy. That, I thought, was that. But no, I was swiftly disabused of any such notion when the exchange formed the centrepiece of a front-page story a couple of weeks later in your favourite and mine, the Australian newspaper. An attack dog reporter by the name of Christian Kerr. Christian, by the way, was using his personal Facebook page to inform his Facebook friends that he was using the pages of the newspaper to further his own political prejudices. He had already declared that on this Facebook page that boycott advocacy was tantamount to anti-Semitism, which I thought at the time was a bit like being sent to report on a Carlton versus Collingwood match and revealing at half-time that you were barracking for one of the two sides. So anyway, I made representations to the newspaper, and I don't know whether it was because of that, but he was eventually taken off the story to be replaced by a much better reporter, Ian Higgins. And Ian Higgins it was who then followed the story through, because it continued, as Duncan was saying, when the case was then taken up by this Israeli law centre, Shurat Hadin. And Shurat Hadin sent me a letter demanding that I recant from my stance and apologise for it, or they would take me to the federal court. And because I said, well, there's absolutely no chance of doing that, that is exactly, in fact, where we ended up. Now, Shurat Hadin features, as a side note really, in the enormous wodge of material released by WikiLeaks a few years ago, the diplomatic cables cables from US embassies around the world, which revealed a great deal about the truth that was being told behind the scenes to American diplomats when they were maintaining a quite different line in public. And one of these lines was from the director of this Shurat Hadin Legal Center, Nitzana Darshan-Leitner. And here she was being recorded in one of these diplomatic cables as boasting to staff at the US Embassy in Tel Aviv about her extensive connections with the Israeli secret state, that Shurat Hadin received directions as to whom to target and occasionally snippets of evidence to use against them from the Mossad and the Israeli National Security Council. So in a sense, Shurat Hadin was also an attack dog, a kind of arm's length, non-attributable attack dog of the Israeli state. And in that, it was in the vanguard of a systematic effort to try to press down on boycott activism around the world in the aftermath of that vote at the UN General Assembly to confer the observer statehood on the Palestinians. In the United States, such efforts are called SLAP, strategic lawsuits against political participation. But there was definitely an attempt in multiple jurisdictions to carry out these court cases to try to make it impossible for people to be advocates of the boycott of Israel. So we found ourselves, therefore, on the receiving end of that. But from the outset, you know, Shurat Hadin went round rattling the collecting tin to the various organisations representing the mainstream Jewish community in Australia, as they call themselves, and were told, no, thank you very much, we want nothing to do with this lawsuit. Because they rightly perceived it as something that was only likely to inflame the issue in the context of public and media opinion. And they didn't want that. And how right they were. Because straight away, the effect of having this lawsuit hanging over us was a galvanizing one. It galvanized hundreds of people, in fact thousands in the end, to sign an online petition vowing to act as co-defendants in the case. And of course that list and that petition was therefore an indispensable campaigning tool when it came to raising the money to just about keep within shouting distance of the ever-increasing legal bills on our side of the case. Now, Shurat Hadin put together a lengthy statement of claim, and they had rounded up a few nefarious individuals, I shouldn't call them that, various individuals from Israel, to join in. One of them apparently was connected with the case because she was the proud owner of a large collection of CDs by Elvis Costello. And I was accused in this statement of claim of influencing Elvis Costello so as not to actually tour Israel and play there. That was one of the effects that was attributed to the boycott movement, you see. So apparently Elvis Costello had been sitting in his home, possibly in Liverpool one time, you know, and said to somebody, you know, I can't go touring Israel because it'll be a political act, you know. That's what he said. And maybe he was even reading one of my columns at the time, you know. This chick, she's got a point, you know. We shouldn't play Israel, but no, I fear that vignette never actually took place. It was rather fanciful, I think, on their part. So I was blamed for that. I was blamed for Meg Ryan not visiting Israel in between having her collagen implants. I was blamed for Snoop Dogg not going to Israel, and so on and so forth. So it was slightly strange. But in legal terms, the point was that by blaming me for all these general effects, it would mean that anybody could join in because anybody would have legal standing in the case. Now, the first thing we did was to get all those portions of the statement of claim effectively struck out, so Shurat Hadin would have to reformulate it, concentrating only on this episode to do with the academic boycott. But they couldn't actually get any academics to join in. They would have to have proved that I was discriminating against Professor Avnon because he was a Jewish Israeli, whereas, as I said at the time, it would make no difference to me if he was a Buddhist from Bendigo. It was the scheme to which I objected, not him. And they would have to have established that I was acting on behalf of the university. At one point, the judge in the case said, oh, well, perhaps we better get the university up here as a co-defendant, at which I could imagine my boss, the Dean of Arts, turning white beneath his tan. But no, that wasn't necessary, and it would have been very difficult to establish that. So in the end, Shurat Hadin had to back off because they lacked legal standing in the case. But we shouldn't let that mask the wider political significance, because in the meantime, of course, the galvanizing effect of the campaign against the court case had begun to spread. And now we have the existence of a number of groups that are up and running, which are dedicated to spreading the boycott call. We have NTEU members for BDS, that's the National Tertiary Education Union. We have Australians for BDS, and we have Sydney staff for BDS. So the cause of boycott activism has actually received a huge shot in the arm from this attempt to stifle us in the courts, which we eventually saw off. So we enter 2015 in a much better condition with this campaign than we entered 2014. Now, one of the objections to the boycott campaign, which I hear from within the peace movement, I mean, I'm a peace professor, okay? So when I go and speak to Palestinians, for example, I do start with a difficulty, because the word peace has fallen into some disrepute among Palestinians, as you can imagine, given all the years in which they've been told that they have to enter a peace process which, according to its broker, the United States, the main diplomatic ally of Israel, of course, has to be without preconditions. That is to say, they should give up any notion of having any rights and instead enter this kind of no-holds-barred process of seeking a compromise with the much stronger party under the auspices of its main arms dealer. So it's an unlikely prospect, I think you'll agree. And even in that story, even when there has been reports of some potential progress, there has invariably been some kind of behind-the-scenes understanding between Israel and the United States that they will not actually have to give up anything. So, for example, the account by two of the main staff negotiators from the Camp David talks of 2000 emphasizes that, in fact, behind the scenes, the Israelis were being given every possible indulgence in not implementing the interim steps or the confidence-building measures that have been agreed to lead up to an eventual peace agreement. At the Taba talks under President Clinton 18 months or so later, it was a back channel that had been established between Israel and the White House in advance of the talks, saying that we have to agree that Israel won't actually go along with whatever's agreed. So even when there has been the appearance of some possible progress, that there hasn't been. So for those reasons, peace has fallen into some disrepute among Palestinians, and therefore, as a peace professor, I can't avoid having that badge of a professor of peace and conflict studies. I have to explain what I mean by peace. What I mean by peace, and what we mean in our centre, is peace with justice. Peace with justice. That is to say, people should not be expected to live with and endure a situation of injustice and an abrogation of their potential, and for that to be called peace. That's not peace. That may be negative peace. It may bring about a temporary absence of direct violence, but it's not positive peace, because it's still a situation of structural violence. So, peace with justice. So therefore, peace with justice cannot be made synonymous with dialogue and conflict resolution. Dialogue and conflict resolution are fine things, necessary things and important things. But peace with justice requires something else besides that, sometimes referred to as the transformation of conflict. Conflict has to be transformed in order for people to have justice, in order for there to be a sustainable peace. And in that, it's very important, I think, to not just have an absence of violence, but to have positive non-violence. Positive non-violence. As John F. Kennedy said, if we make non-violent revolution impossible, we make violent revolution inevitable. As the preamble of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights puts it, these rights must be protected by law, lest people facing tyranny and oppression are forced to have recourse ultimately to violence as a way to get out of it. So in other words, it's in the interests of the oppressed peoples themselves and everyone else to provide and create effective non-violent tactics in pursuit of justice if we want to further the interest that we probably all share of forestalling further violence. And that's where quiescence in the face of this ongoing systematic attempt to normalize the oppression of the Palestinians is not good enough. There has to be, instead, advocacy of effective non-violence if we are going to cease to be part of the problem and become instead part of the solution. There are a multitude of ways that we can all join in. There's somebody left. This very good pamphlet here by Australian Friends of Palestine, Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions, listing a multitude of companies that are complicit in the maintenance of Israel's occupation of Palestinian territory and how we can therefore take action against it. One of them, for example, is Veolia. Veolia is often mentioned. When I'm in Sydney, I sometimes see Veolia trucks buzzing around the streets late at night, taking people's bins away. Well, Veolia is a French-owned multinational, and one of its other guises is to run tramways which connect illegal Israeli settlements to each other and therefore perpetuate the exclusion of Palestinians from their own territory and their own birthright. So if Veolia is responsible for clearing away the bins in your local council area, that hands you a ready-made opportunity to tackle the issue. We in universities now have a pathway proven as watertight in the federal court as to how we can step off the treadmill and make ourselves an exception and say, I'm not going to take part in these corrupt and corrupting so-called fellowship schemes which are part of this ongoing attempt at normalization of the abnormal. There are opportunities and therefore challenges for all of us to involve ourselves, and I'll leave you with words attributed to a famous Jewish writer and Holocaust survivor, Primo Levi. If not us, who? If not now, when?
We're going to go to a Q&A session because I'm sure you're all bursting with questions. There are a million of them. One of the main questions you might be asking is, what can I do? Jake referred to this booklet. We have a box of these booklets. You're welcome to take them home. They're very informative. As Jake pointed out, they do list a lot of the products that do benefit the occupation. But there are other things that you can do. Investment funds. Simply don't buy brand Israel. Look at these things and say, right, I'm not going to buy that. I'm not going to buy that. Write to your politicians. It's very important because without feedback that our politicians are not representing public opinion, nothing will change. I don't know if anyone knows here, but there is an organization called the Australia-Israel Leadership Forum, which is funded by Albert Dadon, who's an Israeli billionaire. He funds both sides of politics on the proviso that the status quo in relation to the political support, unconditional political support for Israel's status quo remains just that. That's what we need to oppose, to actually change the status quo and say it's not good enough.